Welcome to World Social Studies for elementary teachers. This is lecture D3. In this lecture we look at power, specifically the ideas of polarity and hegemony. This lecture looks at the relative power status of countries over another and how countries use their power status to influence others. You should be able to complete all of the objectives listed on this slide after listening to this lecture. When World War II ended, the world found itself in an unexpected and unprecedented Cold War, where the two great powers of the United States and Soviet Union faced off each other over a question of who would hold sway over Europe. Here's a picture of Checkpoint Charlie, and you see the soldiers in uniform staring at each other across the fence that is there, and the American soldier with a bazooka sitting underneath the American flag there, staring at the Russian soldiers across the way. And for 50 years, the world experienced this tense conflict between these two superpowers. The United States had its Western allies, and the Soviet Union had its client states. The competition between these two for control of the global system was called the Cold War because the threat of nuclear destruction meant neither side could risk total war with the contest. This made it different from previous hegemonic struggles that the global system had experienced, if you recall from our lecture on the development of the system. Although it was called the Cold War, this contest was not peaceful, as both sides used client states to fight proxy wars and test the other's abilities to influence situations in far-flung parts of the globe. Here's a picture of U.S. troops fighting in Vietnam as an example of how this conflict was violent, just not a direct conflict between the two countries. The contest for power and hegemony is a recurring theme throughout history, and analysts use the concept of polarity to help describe and understand it. Now, when we talk of polarity, what we mean by that is that great powers attract client states, and they develop spheres of influence, which are regions of the globe that country has a unique impact over, a special relationship to, or large influence over, where other competing powers don't have that same level of influence or control that might have. So that's called a sphere of influence. The use of the word polarity is essentially an analogy to that of a magnet, and a magnet attracts metal shavings to itself. And if there's one magnet on one side of the room and another magnet on another side of the room, those metal shavings will sort themselves out to the nearest or most powerful large magnet. And so that analogy is used to describe the global system and the relative power in the global system. The magnets are the great powers, and the shavings are the minor powers. The shavings are attracted to the nearest or most powerful countries. And it's an analogy of a sphere of influence in the sense of a magnetic influence that a great power would exert. Now, a multipolar system is one that has several powers, great powers of roughly equal ability. They're peers to one another. The Concert of Europe system is an example of when the system was multipolar, when the great kingdoms and princes of the day would gather together in a gilded hall and negotiate with one another the goings-on and doings of far-flung countries. Countries that were affected by those negotiations weren't invited to the room. It was a negotiation between great powers among their peers. The Cold War was a bipolar system, and this is where there are two main influences, and the rest of the system is attracted to either one or the other. So this map illustrates the division of the world into the Cold War alliance system, with the blue countries being the United States and its allies, the red countries being the Soviet Union and its allies, and then China and Southeast Asia and Cuba as communist countries that were sort of putatively allied with the Soviet Union, but not necessarily formally allied. But they're clearly within the sphere of influence of the Soviets, particularly at the beginning of the Cold War. So this is a bipolar system where the entire system is drawn to one or the other. Now you'll notice there are some non-aligned states in the Nordic regions, and as we've discussed with the repercussions of colonialism, the newly independent states in Southern Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are not formally aligned with either side. It was their effort to create a third world to stay out of this bipolar system. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the system became unipolar, with the United States being the uncontested hegemon. As Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, put it, she said that the United States was the indispensable nation. Now, what that means is not necessarily that everyone does exactly what the U.S. tells it to. That's not what she meant. What she meant is that nothing gets done without the United States' help and assistance. That's what indisputable means. And in a unipolar system, that's the reality, that the center or pole exerts tremendous influence and makes decisions about what will happen. So this is a map of U.S. basing throughout the world, with clearly the bright colors being thousands of American troops, the darker blue being just hundreds of troops, and then the purple countries being places that don't have permanent troops but are hosts to U.S. military facilities and repeated activities. Now, if you recall the discussion from the first series on power, about the ingredients of power, if we look at the list of power ingredients, we find that the United States, on almost every measure of power, is ahead of the rest of the world. And on many of those measures, the United States is not just ahead, it is so far ahead that it's in its own category. The United States has a preponderance of power on most of those measures. It's interesting to note that half of all of the money spent on weapons on the planet is spent by the United States. That the global economy is about a fourth of the entire global economy is the United States. This is a cartograph of the global economy, where countries are not represented by their geographic size, they're represented by their relative weight on that measure. And so you see that Canada, which on most maps is a giant place, is this little tiny place. Likewise, Russia, you can hardly make out Russia on this map. It's the light green sliver above the bright green China. And so on an economic scale, Russia's not that powerful. So this is a useful map to look at the relative power in economic terms. The purple is Japan. That giant green sphere in between Japan and China is Taiwan. And so it's tremendously powerful all by itself. And so it's an indication of the tremendous power that the United States has. And if we were to use a cartograph like this on every indication of power, whether it's military weight, agricultural exports, heavy industrialized goods, services, goods and services, financial capital flows, every one of those indicators, the United States is going to be not just bigger, but much bigger than every other state in the world. So it's a visual indication of the hegemonic weight the United States has. Essentially, the United States is the most powerful country the planet has ever seen. Now, some suggest, however, that the U.S. lead is slipping, and that's a fairly clear indicator because the United States can't maintain that preponderant lead forever because other countries are developing, and as they develop, they begin to catch up. So while the United States will maintain an absolute advantage for many years in the future, perhaps generations, it is losing its relative advantage as other states catch up. It has no peer competitors, but other states are rising. And so this leads some analysts to conclude that we are beginning to move away from a unipolar system towards a future multipolar system. We're not in a multipolar system now, but we could be moving in that direction. And so there are various candidates given for who a future peer competitor to the United States might be. One of them is the European Union. Taken collectively, Europe has an economy about the same as the United States. Its population is about the same. Its resource base is about the same. Now, of course, at the current moment, Europe is divided into 15 or 20 countries, so no one of them is a peer. But if the European Union were to coalesce and be able to act in a unified way politically, then it could be a peer competitor to the United States. Many look at China as a future peer. China has had tremendous growth, and if it were to continue that same level of growth, then its economy will surpass the United States economy by around 2030. But many people argue that trajectory cannot continue, that as it grows, its rate of growth will have to slow down. Russia is seen as a potential future competitor. Not that Russia will ever again be the superpower that it was, but as it gets its economic and military act together, it's beginning to exert its influence and try to establish a sphere of influence in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. India is also thrown around as a potential candidate. India has all of the ingredients of a superpower. It just needs to figure out how to make its population base an asset, not the liability that it currently is. Once it develops its human and capital infrastructure, then India will be every bit as powerful as China and perhaps the United States. So these countries are called the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And as they continue to grow, and particularly if they're able to work in unison, then they can become a peer competitor to the United States and perhaps move us into a multipolar system. Now, when assessing relative power, it's useful to have a categorization scheme to be able to place countries in one category or another. Analysts rank order states based on their capacity to influence others. So if we were to think of a scale then of influence, at the bottom of this scale would be the failed state. These are countries that have no influence and are in fact dramatically influenced by others. In fact, these are countries that are so weak they have little or no control over their own territory. If you recall the discussion of state strength, these states are not able to exert their monopoly on the legitimate use of force in their territory. So examples would include Somalia. This slide is a picture of the outskirts of Mogadishu with a UN convoy driving down the street. Other examples of failed states would be Afghanistan and its inability to control its territory outside of its capital. Iraq from 2003 to 2006 was a failed state. It has reestablished its central government control enough to graduate from failed state status. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is usually seen as a failed state because the Eastern Congo is under very little influence or control from the capital, and there's a pretty much constant state of civil war, which draws in neighboring countries in the Congo. So at the bottom end of the scale, we have the failed states. Next up are the weak states. Now, these states, unlike failed states, have functioning governments, but they, like weak states, are unable to enforce their monopoly on force. They have pockets of territory in their country that they don't control, and those pockets then provide safe havens for non-state groups like terrorists or organized crime, and those groups can operate with impunity in their territory. Or perhaps there's a section of their territory that a neighboring state controls, not themselves. Some examples of weak states, states that have safe havens for non-state groups, would be Pakistan. This is a picture on this slide of the Taliban, who have bases in the tribal regions of Pakistan. The government does not exert its influence over those tribal regions. In fact, it has an uneasy peace with those regions, and as long as it doesn't try to bring its army into those territories, then they tend to leave the government alone. But if the government brings a military convoy in to try to assert its control, it's immediately attacked, and so it is a weak state. Kenya has slid into weak state status as increasing levels of violence and anarchy in its urban areas are leading the state to lose its control. Colombia has long been on this list because large swaths of Colombia are controlled by the FARC, which is a leftist rebel group. That is less the case now. Over the years, Colombia has increased its control to where we could arguably take it off this list, but it has not completely defeated the FARC. So until that time happens, it will probably stay on this list. The Philippines is a country that's not often mentioned in the media, but there are entire islands in that archipelago that the government has no control over. And in fact, government officials don't dare go into. Algeria has the same problem in its rural territories in the Sahara. The Ivory Coast is considered a weak state because it's factional fighting between rebel groups and the government forces. The rebels control at times half the country, at other times a fourth of the country, depending on the tide of war. So these are weak states. Again, they have a functional government, but they do not exert governmental authority over the entire region. Next are what, for lack of a better word, we'll call normal states. These are states that are not in danger of losing their state authority. They have functioning state governments. So they're not a weak state. They're not a failed state by any stretch. But they're also not particularly strong in the sense of wielding influence over neighboring states. They're states that are just sort of good citizens on the global arena. They mind their business. They take care of their own country's needs. These are states that competently govern their own territory. So Sweden, Costa Rica, Vietnam, Namibia, there are hundreds of countries that fit on this state. So that's why I have a picture of the United Nations General Assembly here. Most of the countries who show up and vote and attend UN committee meetings would be in this category of just normal everyday states. Moving up on the next step would be regional powers. These are states that have considerable sway over their neighborhood. They usually have an economic influence, but they often provide political leadership as well. They sometimes exert a military control, but not always. In fact, sometimes an attempt to exert a military influence will invite the intervention by a great power, which would actually damage their regional standing. So there are a number of examples. Pretty much every region of the world has a local power that attempts to become a regional power and exert influence over its neighbors. This is a picture of Hugo Chavez attending a meeting of the Bolivarian Alliance, which is a creation by Venezuela to exert its influence and increase its influence over the Andes region. Peru, Bolivia, these countries look to Venezuela for leadership, and so it is a regional power. It competes with Colombia for that power. It also competes with Brazil, but Brazil has more power than Venezuela does. So it attempts to exert that regional influence. Mexico is a regional power. It's often not included on people's lists because it is overshadowed by the tremendous power of the United States. But if Mexico, well, and Canada for that matter, were in any other part of the planet, they would be seen as a major regional power because of the size of their economies, the competence of their militaries. Mexico does exert tremendous influence over its own neighbors to the south in Central America, so we could consider it as a regional power. Egypt sees itself as the center of the Arab world, and many of their Arab neighbors look to Egypt for leadership, that when something happens, they look to Egypt to lead out on that. Nigeria plays that same role in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the peacekeepers that the African Union sends to places like Chad and Somalia and the Ivory Coast are staffed by Nigerian soldiers. So Nigeria has tremendous political and economic influence in sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa competes with Nigeria for the dominant power in Africa, and South Africa does exert the kind of economic and military influence in the cone of Africa and South Africa that Nigeria has in sub-Saharan Africa. Korea exerts some influence, but it is overshadowed by its neighbors Japan and China. But it attempts to have regional influence. It attempts to provide leadership in the ASEAN conference, for example. Australia sees itself as a regional power in the Oceania and Indonesia region. So, for example, when East Timor needed peacekeepers, those peacekeepers were Australian peacekeepers. Finally, Iran I include on this list because Iran is very overtly attempting to create a sphere of influence and become recognized as a regional power in the Gulf. It competes with Egypt and the Saudis for that, and it also competes with the United States, who has no desire to see Iran succeed in its efforts to become a regional power. But with its oil export, with its influence over Shiism in surrounding countries, and with its alleged efforts to develop nuclear weapons. Those can all be seen as attempts by Iran to exert a regional influence. The next step up are the global or great powers. These states have economic interests that are global. They usually possess a military that is capable of protecting those global interests. They provide resources and leadership to coordinate global action. This is a picture of the United Nations Security Council, and the membership of that council is seen as part of being a great power. So there's 5 permanent members are the United States, Russia, England, France, and China. So those countries have that seat of power on the Security Council as a symbol of their great power status. Germany and Japan rotate on and off that council, but they get more turns than other countries do because of their tremendous economic influence that they have. Now, India and Brazil, I have question marks on them because they are increasingly becoming powerful in a global sense. They're members of the G20 now, and they are more and more often becoming invited to key meetings where the global economies and global political and military issues are discussed. I do put question marks because they are not universally recognized as great powers. And they also, at present, lack the ability to exert force and protect, in a military sense, their interests abroad. But once they develop those capacities, then they will have the other ingredients they need to be considered great powers. Now, finally, the highest step in this ladder of power categorizations is the superpower. And at present, there's only one superpower, and that's the United States. The Soviet Union was a superpower, but when it collapsed, Russia does not have the capacities that the Soviet Union did. So Russia is a great power, but it is not a superpower. The defining quality of what makes a superpower is the ability to project force globally. And only the United States can do this. Other countries, other great powers have significant military resources. They do have the ability to protect their interests abroad, but they can't, in a timely manner, send their forces quickly anywhere they want to go in the world. The ability to exert force globally. This picture is of a C-130 tanker refueling fighter aircraft that enables those aircraft to stay in the air for long periods of time. It also enables them to, if you pre-position these airborne fuel tankers, then you can fly an aircraft from the United States across the world. And in fact, this is what the United States does with its stealth aircraft, because it doesn't want to base those aircraft in foreign soil. And so, for example, a B-2 bomber will leave its base in Missouri and fly across the Atlantic Ocean and across the African continent to bomb a payload in Iraq, and then turn around and fly all the way back to Missouri to complete its mission. That kind of global throw weight can only be done by the United States. If the UN Security Council decides it wants to send peacekeepers someplace, and the French and the British and the Canadians and the Nigerians and the Pakistanis volunteer troops to do that, it will take them months, at least weeks, to get there. So the way they get there, if they need to go in a hurry, is the United States is the taxi that delivers the international troops to global hot zones. And the United States military protects those troops in transit and until they establish themselves. And then the United States withdraws, and the international force can be self-sufficient. But getting there, the initial protection, and the intelligence for who they should talk to and who the bad guys are in the hills, that's all provided by the United States. So it's an example of the United States as the superpower and how it acts. Now, states can move up or down this status as their relative power waxes or wanes. So I already gave the example of how the Soviet Union was a superpower but has fallen to the status of a great power, whereas China was a regional power, has advanced to the status of a great power. And India and Brazil have recently advanced from sort of regular state. Actually, they went from a weak state to a functioning state to now regional powers, where in the future, 10, 15 years, we can foresee a time when India and Brazil will be considered great powers. Other countries have a catastrophe and collapse and become a weak state, or weak states become failed states. So this categorization is a useful way to think of relative power in terms of the functions of states and their ability to influence others around them. This presentation was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.